Well, thank you all for being here. And Hari, thanks for tuning in virtually. I want to start with a question that I think each of you can answer in a little bit of a different way because you work on different aspects of climate finance. And I really want to ask you what you see as a key roadblock that is currently preventing the acceleration of climate finance, and perhaps what some of the solutions are that you guys are working on to address that challenge. Daniel, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thanks, Adva, for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I guess, so from my perspective with the climate investment funds, just for everyone's awareness, we are a $10 billion fund that works to facilitate investments from multilateral development banks using concessional finance that can be transformational, it can be flexible, and used at below market rates in a lot of situations. And so when we go into different contexts, different country contexts, different markets, I think there's a slew of roadblocks that we encounter. But what they all kind of are related to is sort of risk perception and different investors sort of not understanding the risks that they're coming into. It could be country risk, it could be political risk, it could be technology risk. But that seems to be what's holding them up. And so the solution to that is to really start to mitigate those risks for them. And that can take a number of different forms, which we'll get into in the panel. But I think sort of a combination of leadership from governments, public resources, sort of attacking the areas that are really key for accelerating things, and sort of doing the work on the ground, sort of proof of concept, can really help speed things along.
Great. Kate, do you want to jump in? I mean, I think you're doing some really interesting things also with technology and looking at how AI can help.
Sure, and Daniel actually couldn't have teed that up better for me, so it's very easy to follow on to that. So as you said, Nithio is a platform for financing energy access. What we really saw was missing was ability to understand risk and then ability to really drive large-scale efficient capital deployment to climate problems. And I think that's where we really honed in on household credit risk specifically. We're looking in the household energy space and felt like there wasn't large-scale, especially climate-oriented investment coming in because no one could really understand what was happening with financing of energy access technologies. And if you could understand what's happening with the financing of those systems, that kind of trickles back to being able to understand the portfolio and being able to have much larger scale investment. So I think that's really the key point. And we do use an AI-powered model to better understand that household credit risk and some really interesting data sources. But we also saw was missing was the infrastructure for that capital deployment. That's why we run a financial intermediary, trying to bring in blended finance, public resources, private resources, to be able to reach everyone. And just the final point, I think what we see as missing is a focus on climate justice, on adaptation, resilience. So much of the climate finance right now goes to renewable energy, carbon mitigation. 100% agree that that is absolutely essential, but there's a lot of people already suffering on the ground, and we need to be working to solutions for them as well.
Well, I think you've probably now teed things up perfectly for new.
I think we're done. I think we can go home now. Yeah. I've spent the past 15 years in the financial sector, but before that, I was in the real economy, most recently in forest products, and got a better appreciation of sustainability issues. So most recently, I've been advising policymakers, primarily central banks, and trade associations, so banking associations on the continent around sustainable finance and responsible investment. And it's exactly what Kate is saying. When you look at the trends, there seems to be a misalignment. And I think global finance doesn't really appreciate the context within which Black and brown people operate, right? So financing for energy is easy to come by because those are your $1 trillion and $1 billion deals. It's efficient to deploy the capital. Your stakeholders are happy. But when you talk about transitioning to the green economy, it requires an economy-wide shift. On the continent, most of the global south, and I'll argue even here in the US, your economies are based on the informal sector, right? So more than 50% of your GDP here in the US is SME-driven. Same in Africa, if not more. When you look at the turnover for some of these businesses, it's really small, something that probably the DFIs would not even get out of bed for. So when you start looking at how technical assistance programs are being structured around ESG and sustainable finance, you realize there's that misalignment, right? You're not appreciating the context, you're not appreciating the normative culture within which these actors are operating, but now we're all pushing for 2050, net zero by 2050, right? So these are some of the policy issues that I'm trying to help solve.
Yeah, and I think we'll dive more into that and the importance of not only diverse voices, but driving capital to a more diverse group of actors in this space and what that means for achieving these goals. Hari, I want to turn to you if you want to jump in with your thoughts on what some of the key roadblocks or challenges you're seeing.
No, absolutely. So I run a firm called Eco Advisors, and we provide a connection between capital in all its forms, so financial and technical, reputational, a variety of capital, and environmental solutions around the world. And the three of you teed this up perfectly. The three things I was going to talk about are, first, there's an inertia hurdle. So I think people have made commitments, but there's still a reluctance to actually act on those commitments. So there's money sitting on the sidelines but not moving. And I think part of the reason for that is because there's still this notion that we have to make a trade-off for climate-aligned investing versus profit-motivated investing. Now, that's not entirely true, but there's a legacy kind of convention that we believe that there's a trade-off in all situations. And I think we need to get over that. Second is that I think that the skill set required for sourcing, diligencing, and overseeing climate-aligned or sustainability-themed investing is fundamentally different. We're talking about a new asset class. And what we're seeing is people from conventional finance trying to orient conventional diligence tools and oversight tools on a new asset class that doesn't conform. I'd like to pick up a couple of threads. So I think, Daniel, you talked about risk. I think that's a clear and fundamental roadblock, and we need to figure out solutions whereby we can reduce risk and use concessionary and blended capital to lower the risk appetites to get more conventional investors on board, to drive more capital towards solutions. I think this notion of understanding cash flows and dynamics and coming up with creative models. So I think the work that you're doing at Nithio is fantastic, because I think fundamentally the transition finance required is going to need different tools and different forms of debt and equity to understand the differences in cash flow dynamics and payback dynamics relative to conventional retrofits in the past. And then finally, Nuru, your point about the connection between capital and community is I think, one of the most fundamental roadblocks. And we need to get more voices from the emerging markets in the global south, black and brown voices, but voices all around, right? We heard in the last session about gender being needing to be integrated into everything. But I think this voice of all people being affected by climate change, which is everybody, needs to rise up to the top for decisions to be made. And I think this disconnect between capital, really understanding the systems and the context that communities are facing in places where they want to invest, is a fundamental roadblock that we need to shift. We need to educate people more about what the context is like on the ground, and not believe that you can invest from London or New York or wherever in the global north and believe that it's going to work in other places where you've never been and don't understand. So we need to connect those communities.
So I want to pick up on this, because a lot of you have mentioned this need to be more inclusive in climate finance. So let's talk about how do you get there, right? Because so we recognize it's a challenge. How do you get there? What mechanisms need to be in place? Is it policy? Is it regulatory? Is it, I mean, because people often give money to people who look like them. We know that. So how do you change that dynamic?
So I would say it's a bit of everything. It's like an alphabet soup, right? So depending on the market. So looking at Kenya, for example, when we did our analysis in terms of where climate finance is going, it's certainly the energy sector. But Kenya is a multi-sectoral economy. So we have tourism, we have agriculture, we have forestry products, education, of course, telecommunications. I think many of us know about M-Pesa. So when you look at that kind of market structure, and 70 to 80% of climate finance is solely going to energy, then you realize that policymakers need to have a look at what's the enabling environment, how can we incentivize donors, the global financial markets, to start allocating capital where they don't have a stake. And when I say don't have a stake, I think a lot of times investors obviously want the return, the payback, but they also are it's a trade issue, right? It's trade. So there are inputs that are going into those sectors that the donors are benefiting from as well. So how do you start incentivizing global finance to look at other sectors that perhaps they don't have any inputs, right? Like health, education, things that help build social welfare and lower the social costs. So I think policy has a big role to play. I think it's encouraging to see what's going on in the responsible investment space, where you have activists, and I don't want to use the word activists, but they really are, activist investors really helping shape mandates. And I think also there's an issue of capacity building, not only in the real economy, but in the financial sector. When I deal with a lot of policymakers on the continent, this is a big issue. The regulators are often playing catch up with the market, trying to understand, bring in the definitions, the taxonomies, and the roadmaps. So there's a lot of capacity building that's also needed. I don't know what you...
No, again, building off that, because I think it's, even though the energy sector does get a lot of attention, we see in the off-grid solar sector, every year, 75% to 90% of the total investment in the sector goes to the top 10 companies, which are all international.
Right, yeah.
And they are serving people on the ground in a lot of these markets, but there's a need to actually focus on these distributors who are local also, who are deeper into the remote rural areas, are probably employing more local staff. And so in Nithio, we've really tried to commit, because we take this data-driven approach, we feel like we can work across the entire sector. And that's to the benefit of everyone. Mm-hmm. But it means that there needs to be partnerships. We just announced investments we made in Kenya with local companies working in partnership with US African Development Foundation. Mm-hmm. It does take a lot of capacity building or extra work. And I feel like that's where some philanthropic money or donor money to make sure that these companies are ready for investment, that they've got all the documentation in order, they've got the financial model in order, so that they're ready to receive that investment. Because I do think there are investors out there who want to support them and like what they're doing, but there's that added element. And people just need to be patient in some cases and really commit to growing those companies, because they're there for the long run. And I think there's also markets that we see where, for example, off-grid solar is not taken off, and there needs to be investment in the local companies. They're more likely to be there.
Yeah. So one thing I want to follow up with there, and because I want to come to you, Daniel, because I think that where you're sitting, you have some of that capital that Kate's talking about, right?
The money.
So sure. Can you make that happen? But I think another disconnect is sometimes people don't know how to find those local companies, right? Yes. So what role can you play as that sort of bridge builder and to help provide some of that capacity development?
Yeah, I mean, we can provide that, and sort of the role that the climate investment funds has historically played is not only this source of concessional capital that can help move MDBs like the World Bank and the regional development banks to do things that they haven't done before, but we can...
That's a pretty hard job though, right?
It is.
They don't like to do things.
No, not necessarily, but when you have cheap money, they're more interested in doing it, right? And so part of what we try to do is sort of within our structures and our requirements sort of push them in the right direction. So for example, we're talking about gender and social inclusion. We just recently took a decision this year for like all our energy projects moving forward, or most of them, need to have discussion of not just gender, which has been in place. We've had gender action plans in place since 2014, but now they need to talk about social inclusion. How will the projects incorporate social inclusion and just transition principles? Right. So, you know, when you have a little bit of leverage, making it not just mainstream, but like really a part of the fabric of operations in projects and things like that is the way to take advantage of it. And I mean, one example where we've had some success is in the Maldives, where we've been doing off-grid solar and batteries to help replace diesel generation. One of the projects that we helped support along with the World Bank had a gender action plan that basically provided the capacity building and the technical assistance to the utilities to help them reach out to women, to gender NGOs in country and others. They were able to do consultations on 88 different islands, incorporating 12,000 different people, and eventually they were able to hire 140 women to come and work in the utilities on these projects. So it happens, it can happen at small scale, and the idea is you do these initial pushes that then trickle through these large systems that you hope, those changes aggregate.
I think what Daniel is saying is a really important point, how finance can help shape outcomes that are beyond returns. So I know a wonderful example in Turkey, for example, a financial institution required their power producer client to weave in certain gender indicators along their supply chain, and once they hit certain targets, they would lower the interest rate on the facility. And by doing that, you can start incentivizing incentives, right? We are all incentive driven.
We all
so you
respond to
can,
them.
yeah. So by doing that, you can start incentivizing the real economy to start paying attention to ESG issues. Yes.
So I want to talk about ESG a little bit more because, and I think sometimes there is a disconnect between the type of climate finance we're talking about in emerging markets, frontier markets, and the broader ESG discussion where a lot of the funds are not flowing to those markets. But we are seeing sort of an explosion of metrics and standards, et cetera. Do you think those can help drive the type of climate finance that we're talking about? Do they need to be adapted or changed? Obviously, they're changing. There's not one single standard. It's still a bit of a tricky and evolving space. There's potential for greenwashing. It's not easy. I get that. I know I'm asking a complex question, but can we see some of that financing, especially with big financial companies committing to net zero targets, starting to flow into these markets, and what needs to be done to sort of make that connection? Hari, do you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, sure. No, it's a great question. I'll start off my answer with a couple of positive notes. So first of all, I'd like to say that we've come a long way. I've been working in the climate finance and sustainability finance space for about 20 years. And we had a long, drawn-out discussion at the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, at the multinational level to talk about how to get to a manageable future, right? And Paris happened in 2015. In 2018, we had a voluntary disclosure in the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. And that's a voluntary standard, but it changed the dynamic overnight. In September 2018, when that report came out, from one day to the next, we had a discussion among governments at the UNFCCC that converted into a recognition from institutional investors that climate was a fiduciary responsibility and material for financial decision-making. And that changed the conversation completely. And if we fast forward from 2018 to today, now we've moved from a voluntary disclosure environment into regulated disclosures. SFDR in Europe, the open commentary for the SSE disclosure, climate disclosure requirements in the US, which hopefully will make more headway, and it's going to be regulated soon. So I'd just like to say, while it's complicated, while it seems like it's taking a while it seems like there's lots of standards out there, the advancement in the last 4 years is actually pretty phenomenal. And if we compare 100 years ago to the standardization of accounting standards, just financial accounting, that took decades and decades. And I feel like we're going to get to a holistic and uniform accounting system for environment, social governance factors in a much shorter time frame. So I just want to put that out there as a positive attribute. I will say it is going to be hard though. And I think one of our biggest failures is combining environment, social, and governance factors into this ESG bubble, which is extremely broad. And it's very difficult to have one unifying score on ESG. And we saw that with Tesla's removal from the S&P, the sustainable index for the S&P 500, because they might perform decently on some aspects, but not so well on other social and governance aspects. And this is going to happen more and more, where companies focus on one element, say climate, but ignore the governance principles and equity principles that are important and integral for overall ESG performance. I think we're going to need to separate those out and try to figure out exactly how to address the climate issue, how to address other social and governance issues, and then think at a systems level about how those all integrate, but not in one unifying score as ESG, but as separate kind of components to achieve all 17 SDGs.
So actually, I share Hari's optimism on this, that I think it is getting better and better. But I think the focus is still, at least on the environmental side and the climate side, on carbon mitigation. And again, no issue with carbon mitigation. That should be where the focus is. But we really struggle to quantify or measure in any way that is useful adaptation and resilience, especially in an off-grid environment. And it's one of the things we see as blocking capital flows because so many investors have a carbon requirement. And if you're looking at providing energy supply to an off-grid household, which is literally allowing them to own their energy source and giving them the kind of autonomy to own their energy source, they were previously using kerosene. Offset of kerosene, not a big carbon reduction. If they're in Kenya, offsetting grid usage, Kenya has one of the greenest grids in the world. So you're not going to get this big carbon reduction, but that doesn't mean it's not something extremely important to that household's ability to weather changes, to be able to manage that. So I think that's what we're always looking for. If anyone has really good metrics on that, please find me afterwards, because we're really trying to track
I
that.
do wonder, so you mentioned the TCFD. There's obviously a sort of parallel effort on the nature or biodiversity front, which I think can get at some of these issues. The TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and they recently, in the past couple of weeks, released a second draft of the framework. That's sort of moving along. It's expected September 2023 to be released. We'll see if we have the same sort of uptake and the changes we saw from the TCFD. But I mean, do you think that has the ability to help in addressing some of that?
Somewhat. I think it gets at the definitely the land use implications and things like that. But I think what we're really looking for is what's the benefit to that household of not being connected at the end of a very long grid line that gets knocked out every time there's a weather event. That's the piece of it. And I think there are other ways that you can look at the economic impacts of, say, building a seawall or other adaptation measures. But these are really at the household level. And I think that's what's been tricky for anyone to focus on.
Yeah.
Maybe I could also echo, for the past 10 years, I've been advising the Sustainable Banking and Finance Network, which is a network of 43 countries, central bankers, trade associations, ministries of finance. And we have seen, and what Harry is saying is correct from a policy perspective, you're seeing more IDA countries, global south countries, policymakers really making purposeful steps towards putting in sustainable finance roadmaps, green finance roadmaps. The sequencing is the issue. Do you do the taxonomies first, or do you get the demonstration transactions, or do you build capacity? So really that's what's the issue. On TCFD, I have a somewhat controversial view. Again, it speaks to the misalignment. If you look at the requirements, the metrics that are expected, the market has to be at a very elevated level of capacity when it comes, and the data has to be there. In Africa, policymakers are struggling with TCFD. There are aspects from a risk management, yes, but the other pillars, there's some challenges there. So I think, again, it has to be contextualized, right? And I remember how when my mom was growing up, she grew up literally in a forest. Her dad was a police officer. We were on the route for elephants. And every night and every morning they would come on the same route. Sometimes they would stop and knock down a house. Sometimes they would eat the bananas and the maize. So when you're telling this kind of a market, environment first before social, what is the carbon emissions for your trade? You realize that the context problem, right? So a lot of these global initiatives like TCFD is failing to pay attention to the context of the market. It's necessary, it's important, but I think sometimes we just need to contextualize and look at the priorities.
So important. And I think, I mean, I think one of the sort of debates that's arisen especially in the last year coming out of the COP, is this sort of tension between climate finance and carbon emission reduction goals.
Over people.
Over people and over economic development, particularly in Africa. We're seeing African leaders speak up and say, look, you're, especially in response to the Ukraine war, trying to exploit more gas resources in your country. And on the other hand, you're like, dire climate situation, cannot invest in the gas resources we have in our country when millions of people are without access to power. So, you know, I think some of you maybe have different sort of opinions about where that tension lies. I know we've talked about this a little bit, but I'm curious how you think that plays out in this discussion, because it certainly is informing and influencing sort of the politics behind it, some of the things that are happening at the multilateral development banks, pressure from governments to sort of shift what DFIs are doing, and also, how is that aligned with the people and the places where this investment is going? So I'm curious what you think about that, and how, you know, will it come to a head? What happens next on that front?
So I think, sorry.
No,
I think I've come from far, so I'm going to talk. So I think COVID has reminded us about humanity, and it has reminded us that you can't have finance without people. You can't have the environment without people. So the social aspect. So we talk a lot about ESG, but really it should be S first, before the G and the E. Because if individuals who are all self-motivated and we put our individual needs first before society, before the country, before the world, if the individual needs are not taken care of, then of course we're going to have governance issues, and of course the environment is going to be degraded. So I think COVID has reminded us that, because we saw how quickly economies are near collapse, how quickly governments are near defaulting on their commitments, because society is not taking care of education and health and trade in the informal sector. So I think, again, I want us to have an optimistic view, as much as I might not have sounded like it, but I think policymakers are paying attention. I think how economies are rebuilding back from the COVID situation is really thinking about issues around inclusion more. So we do thank such initiatives like Black Lives Matter, because we're reminding ourselves that life matters. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Well, I think for us it comes, I think you spot on and absolutely true. And I think for us it comes back to justice and equity, that you're looking, I mean, we work entirely in Africa right now, that it's a continent that's produced 2% of global emissions, and yet is not able to use all of its resources. And I think that's where, I mean, a bit back to the metrics, you know, I'm sure everyone in this room talks about you can only fund what you can measure. But some of these issues are moral issues, and maybe it won't be easy to quantify what's the impact to that household to be able to have the right environmental standards or to be able to have energy access, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And I think that's what it's a bit of a struggle with, is if it's not quantifiable, can we still fund it, and how do we make that case?
Great. Hari, did you want to?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that's been said on this subject so far. 2 points I'd like to add. One is that I think the framing is really important. So I think the framing of either climate or sustainability or development and progress needs to be shifted into how do we find solutions where we can maximize or advance both. I think that much like the gender question that we were listening to in the previous session, climate needs to be integrated into everything that we do. But I think where we get confused is that we think that climate concerns need to be maximized in everything that we do, which is where we get that trade-off question. I think we need to integrate climate into all decisions that we make, and then understand that all those decisions exist in a system and in a contextual environment where you might have to make a trade-off decision for that household, Nuru, your example. I also think that if we don't integrate climate into everything that we do, then the short-term sort of trade-off decisions that we make will result in medium and long-term decisions that we no longer have the ability to make, because without a stable climate where humanity can live, there is no more humanity and development and progress. So I think we need to really understand that what we're talking about here is not a trade-off in one point in time. It's the persistence of humanity on this planet in generations to come.
Great. Well,
Can I just add one small bit of optimism to wrap things up?
Please.
I mean, I think I agree with everything said. It's a real good discussion. I just want to add that the word has gotten out from what I've seen in sort of the past year, and we have donors, which, you know, we get our money from sovereigns, from like G7 and other North countries, coming to us and saying, these are things that we want you to figure out how to track and measure. And maybe you can't find it with data, but we want to know co-benefits. We're interested in just transition. We want to make that happen. So when you're getting through big bureaucracies saying this is a priority, then the word is getting out, and so we can, you know, move forward. Obviously, there will be a lot of stumbling along the way, but now we're in a place where we can all kind of head in that direction and try to find the best path forward.
Great. Well, thank you for ending us on a positive note, and thank all of you for joining us for this great conversation. We could talk for a lot longer, but we are out of time. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.